In the book Steamboat Disasters and Railroad Accidents in the United States, written by Southworth Allen Howland and published in 1840, the following statements were made about the construction of the home. Quote, "We have no evidence that, in her model or timbers, any reference was had to a capacity for encountering the perils of the ocean. But candor compels us to say that her model, the time of her lying unemployed, and other circumstances, induce the convictions that she was never intended for a sea-boat. If she was so intended, then those who had charge of her construction should never again attempt to plan a vessel."
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story, "The Fragile Home in Pieces"?
Here we are. Enjoy!
The Home was a side-wheel steamship made specifically for James P. Allaire of New York, partial owner of the New York and Charleston Steam Packet Company, America's first coastal steam packet line. The 550-ton ship was launched in April of 1836, but was not completed until January 1837, and even after completion, lay at the dock unused until April of 1837. She was a beautiful ship, both inside and out, by all accounts, with accommodations that would offer comfort even to the wealthy businessmen of New York, and not be found wanting. She was among the ships of the era to be dubbed a floating palace. This was not to say that she only had accommodations for the wealthiest members of society in princely staterooms. In total, she had space for 120 passengers. The Home's first voyage to Charleston and back to New York in April passed without incident, and her second voyage on the same route made history with its speed. Never before had a ship made the voyage from New York to Charleston in only 64 hours. She was not only a very comfortable ship to travel on, but she was also fast. Two facts that were guaranteed to attract passengers. This attractiveness was not shared by some of the seafaring community, who were starting to whisper already that she was not seaworthy, and that during her first trip she had been damaged by the improper loading of ballast. The newspapers did not share this part of the ship's story, though, and for those people who only saw the triumphant statements of speed, there was no cause for concern. Therefore, as the Home left New York on the afternoon of October 7th, 1837, for her third run down to Charleston, she had on board an estimated 90 passengers, in addition to her crew of 45. She was sailing under the command of Captain Carleton White, a man who had a reputation as a good captain. Unfortunately for those on board of the Home, the ship Voyage met with difficulties almost as soon as they left New York. Only about an hour and a half after their departure, they grounded on the Romer Shoal off of the coast of New Jersey, mistaking the markings for the Gedney Channel for the marker that showed the Romer Shoal, and choosing their course badly. This was not Captain White's fault. He had gone to answer a question the steward had about their guest list, but had left the wheel in an experienced helmsman's hands. When he came back on deck and saw the direction they were heading, he rushed to try to correct the course, but it was too late. It was ebb tide at the time, and they soon found that they were not able to get the ship off of the shoal until the tide came in. They were fortunate in that the evening was a calm one, with no heavy waves to rock the ship on the shoal. The passengers did not experience the grounding of the ship with calm, however, mostly because many of them did not understand, and they thought the reason the ship had been stopped was because the ship was on fire. The captain did his best over dinner to reassure them, and at about 10:30 at night, the ship was able to be freed with the high tide. It was reported that there was no damage to the ship in this adventure, though this would later be called into question. Captain White declared that there were no problems with the machinery or the ship itself. Problems with the machinery would follow the next day, however. In the afternoon of the next day, the wind began to pick up with indications of a storm, and at about 7 p.m., the chief engineer came and reported to Captain White that the feeder pipe on the forward boiler had opened at the joint, meaning that more water was now getting into the hold of the ship than the boiler. With the boiler no longer getting enough water, they were forced to travel sail-assisted, with only one boiler in operation so they could limp into the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay for shelter. Once out of the rough seas, they were able to repair the feeder pipe and continue their voyage once more. On the morning of the third day of their voyage, they were now in a full gale, the force of which was continuously increasing. Some of the passengers were also deeply displeased because water had come into their berths during the night due to the stormy seas. In the midst of this, the second engineer came to Captain White and reported that both boilers had given out, and the ship was now a sailing vessel alone. Captain White ordered the ship be turned towards the shore in case they needed to beach her, and meanwhile he went down to speak with his chief engineer. It turned out that there had been a misunderstanding of the situation by the second engineer, causing a fireman who had communicated badly, and it was not that both boilers had gone out, but instead that the feeder pipe had failed again. The feeder pipe had been patched again, and Captain White, mindful of the fact that the ship was now headed towards the shore, verified that it should hold at least long enough to get them away from the shore again. The chief engineer said that it should. They did safely get away from the shore again, but the situation had done nothing to ease the feelings of the passengers. The passengers began to mutter to themselves that Captain White seemed to be intoxicated. One particular passenger named Lovegreen decided to take it upon himself to get the boats prepared, in case they needed them. Captain White, seeing him busy around one of the boats, went to investigate, and could find no fault with it, though he did caution Lovegreen not to cast off any of the lashings. 3 heavy waves struck the ship soon after this, which took out some of the windows of staterooms, and one of the dining room windows. With this series of events, 2 captains, who were both on board as passengers, seemed to have taken an active interest in participating in the management of the ship. The involvement of these men was later rumored to have been caused by the first mate. It was said that he found Captain White to not be sober, and with the ship in danger, he asked one of the captains on board as a passenger to take charge of the vessel. Captain Hill took it upon himself to knock some of the boats from the forward bulwark so that water could drain off of the deck as it crashed over them from the rough seas. This was work Captain White did not see much point in, since the sea had already burst some of the boards off, but he allowed Captain Hill to do it. In the meantime, Captain Salter came and asked if he should start looking for a place to beach the ship. Captain White replied that he did not intend to do that, so long as he could keep her off of the shore. The chief engineer of the ship was soon reporting a new and more urgent problem with Captain White. There was a leak somewhere, and it was more than the ship's engine pumps could manage. He asked if some men could be sent to the hand pumps, which Captain White did. Captain Salter and Captain Hill then went to Captain White and asked him to accompany them in searching for where the water was coming from. Thinking it was coming from the forward part of the ship, they went there but found it entirely dry. Though Captain Salter remarked that the boat was sealed with thin pine planking, while it should have been sealed with 7-inch oak timber. With there no water found, Captain White ordered the crew to start bailing the engine room, while some of the passengers began to remove coal from the aft of the ship so that they could bail there. The water was gaining on them, though, in spite of everyone available being put to work to fight the rising waters. Soon, the water was washing the coal around the deck and making it too wet to feed the boiler. Captain White ordered that wood begin to be passed down to feed the boiler instead. They continued this way until 8 that night, when the chief engineer again found Captain White, this time to tell him that the engine fire had gone out. The water had become too high. This also meant that they no longer had use of the engine pump, though that had not been working well in any case. It drew up too much sawdust and other debris that clogged it, and meant that they had to clear it too often. Most of the water removal that was being done at all was being done with hand pumps and bailing. Captain White had hoped that they would last until they could reach a harbor near Cape Hatteras, but now he was finally forced to concede to Captain Salter's previous recommendation. He was going to have to run his ship ashore and hope for the best, as grim as the prospect seemed. The waterlogged vessel, under the power of only sail, made a slow progress towards the land. Especially since the ship's sails were in tatters, giving Captain White a chance to go to his cabin for a minute to grab his jacket. By now, most of the people who had been bailing had been driven on deck, no longer able to stay below due to the rising waters. On the way back, a passenger standing on the deck stopped Captain White to ask if there was a chance they would be saved. Captain White, erring perhaps a little too much on the side of honesty, replied that there was very little. The surf was too heavy, and the boats would be of no use. Captain Salter was apparently more optimistic because he called out to make sure the ship's boats were ready. Captain White's last thought before the ship struck was to call out to the helmsman to make sure that he jumped clear of the wheel when the ship struck, or it would break his bones. The ship struck the outer reef and immediately turned broadside, causing her to be repeatedly battered by the rough waves while many of the passengers rushed to the shore side of the ship, hoping it would offer some protection. 30 or so passengers rushed into a corridor that allowed some shelter for a time, but it was dark and so crowded that no one could move. Everyone in the corridor knew that there was very little chance of escape for where they were hiding. It was just a temporary shelter. The women had been given strips of blanket earlier in the afternoon, in the hopes that they could use them to tie themselves to wood and float ashore that way. But in the fury of the storm, few people seemed to have tried it. The first mate came to Captain White and asked if he was going to head to the boats, but Captain White said no. He didn't think they stood a chance, but he did encourage the first mate to go help launch them in case they did succeed. The larboard quarter boat was the first to be launched, but it was immediately upset. The larger boat was launched successfully, and both mates as well as many passengers got into it, but it only got 10 yards from the home before it also upset and threw everything into the ocean. The starboard boat was useless. It was stove in by the waves before they even tried to launch it. By now, the ship was breaking up quickly. The mast had broken, the dining cabin was gone, half of the staterooms were smashed in by the waves, the forward smoke chimney fell across the deck, and the starboard paddle box was demolished. Through all of this, the passengers who had been trying to cling to the railings of the ship were being swept off of the ship by the waves. One of the waves split the deck over the corridor that the other passengers were sheltering in, and at least one man and his wife were able to escape through the crack in the deck, though he was not certain if anyone else was able to follow after him. Captain White removed his jacket, boots, and vest, and taking a hold of a ladder and some rope, he prepared for the moment when he imagined they would end up in the water. Around him, others did the same, including the chief engineer. The men were soon forced to move, however. The deck below them was breaking up, and both the engineer and Captain White made a run for the forecastle, which seemed the most intact by this point. Among the others who were sheltering in the forecastle was Captain Salter, who greeted Captain White and gave him an end of rope to hang on to. Captain Salter admitted that he had picked out the forecastle as the best place to shelter in such an eventuality long before the ship had ever gone to shore. Through all of this, the passenger Lovegreen, who had prepared the boats for launch when the weather initially got rough, was tolling the ship's bell hoping it would attract help. Fortunately for Captain White, the forecastle deck broke from the ship as a single piece and floated to shore like a raft, with himself and 6 other people on board. As they headed towards the nearby lighthouse, they met with other survivors. First they found Lovegreen, and then they found Captain Hill, who needed help to walk with them. Captain Salter would also eventually reach the shore safely. Having found survivors washing ashore, Captain White and a sailor remained on the beach to see if they could help anyone else, while the rest of their party continued to the lighthouse. People did wash ashore. A passenger named Roland had not waited for the ship to break apart. He had calculated his chances on a wrecked ship in a storm versus swimming to shore, and, having taken off his jacket and shoes, he dove into the water. He was carried about 1.5 miles from the wreck down the coast by the currents, but he reached the shore safely. Lovegreen, who tolled the bell until almost everyone was off of the ship, also successfully swam to shore. Mrs. Schroeder, who had been tied to a piece of the ship as it broke apart, managed to reach the shore in this way. Mrs. Lacoste, a woman of 70 years old, floated to shore safely on a settee. These 2 would be the only women who reached safety. Only one child would safely reach the shore, a boy of 12. A tragedy when the list of families who had been on board was released. Of particular interest to newspapers was that 2 of the passengers had life preservers, the only 2 on board, and both of them had survived. The newspapers began to speculate how many more might have been saved if there had been more life preservers. The population in the area quickly rushed to help the shipwreck victims, and everyone agreed that they had met with kindness. There were allegations later, though, that the trunks that washed ashore, which could have been used by the passengers and crew who had come ashore barely clothed, were all found mysteriously empty. There was little that could be done about this, especially since it could be claimed that the trunks had been emptied by the sea before coming to shore. And so the focus of the survivors was recovering the deceased who washed ashore and giving them a burial. Once this was done, the passengers and crew all scattered to their hometowns and destinations, and all of them had a story to tell. In total, it was found that of the crew, only Captain White and 19 members of his crew survived. Captain White was the only officer to reach the shore. The 2 mates as well as 3 engineers on the ship were all lost. 20 of the passengers also survived, meaning that 95 lives were lost in the terrible disaster. The public interest in the wreck was intense, and soon the government of South Carolina, the government of Charleston, and a committee of interested citizens in Charleston were all gathering to discuss what had happened. The committee returned with a finding that the ship had not been safe, and that Captain White had not been sober, thus causing the wreck. Though the idea that Captain White was intoxicated was a serious charge, at least one passenger wrote that it would not have mattered much when it came to the events that took place, that the ship was simply poorly built. Captain White also protested that he had been sober the entire time, and there was little to prove or disprove it other than testimony from one side or the other. That the home had been unsafe was something that was much more widely agreed on, though different reasons were given. Some people thought it was a fault of steamships entirely. They were not as well balanced as sailing vessels. Others pointed to the unusually long length of the home as a fatal flaw. It had been too much strain on her. Her materials were also called into question. There was talk about whether she had even been built for ocean-going purposes, or if she had been intended as a river craft and then repurposed. Several people complained that Captain White should have gone into a port immediately after grounding his ship and ensured she was in good condition before continuing the voyage. Wasn't it possible that the reason why she had started leaking was because of damage done to her when she had grounded? It was true that another ship in the same storm had almost shared the same fate as the Home, but it had reached a harbor safely in the end, and that suggested to many people that there had been something wrong with the Home. As a result of the wreck, South Carolina began to place pressure on the federal government to create more safety acts to regulate steam vessels. Meanwhile, the city of Charleston passed an ordinance that steamboats must be inspected, though this proved hard to enforce on such a small scale as a single city. The owners of a steamboat line that traveled between Norfolk and Charleston decided on a more immediate action. They ordered a large number of life preservers for all of their ships. But this was a voluntary action, and not many lines would follow suit. Still more large steamship disasters would soon follow, and in 1838, Congress would finally issue the first legislation that would make steamships carry safety equipment and undergo annual hull inspections, among other things. Ships carrying passengers had to carry a certificate showing they were compliant. It was a start, but many more disasters were to come.
For more information, please see The Tragedies of the Sea by Charles Elms, published in 1841, or see our other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.